Welcome to a Passamaquoddy Lodge Talk. Interesting to think that a full-time police inspector would also have the time, energy, and inclination to study First Nations, Indigenous, Métis relationships in all of their aspects, and you've done a good job at it. What was the motivation?
Alan, it wasn't a result of policing within the big city in Toronto. It was more as a result of having been assigned to the Ipperwash Inquiry, which was an inquiry into a protest by First Nations people at Stony Creek. It was a lands claim issue during which the OPP had been sent in to intervene, and a First Nations protester, Dudley George, had been shot. I was involved in that process, and it occurred to me then very often police are put in these situations of trying to resolve these disputes when in fact police have very little authority to do anything. And that's what prompted me to try to look at what the role of policing is and other ways of trying to resolve issues, especially with First Nations people, which then led me to take an LLM program at Osgoode Hall in alternative dispute resolution, which is where we met. I think that was the genesis of this interest in this area.
And that Master's in Law program touched on other aspects of the questions that intrigued you. Speak to them.
Well, it opened up my understanding of areas of alternative dispute resolution, restorative justice, for example, circle conferencing, and how these very special and unique processes are being employed across the world. And in fact, we've appropriated them from First Nations people, their practices, and the importance of having an understanding of these processes within an evolving society.
Now, you also took a look at not just Indigenous methods of law and justice and so on, and how they meld with other systems, but also the relationships between and among immigrants, new Canadians, and the Indigenous population. Speak about that. It's
important, I think, to understand as Canadians that there may be two different mindsets on what Canada is. One is sort of the pre-1988 mindset of immigrants, such as myself, who I came to Canada in the 1970s, a 9-year-old boy, and I lived under the Pre-Multiculturalism Act, which was instituted in 1988. Anybody that came prior to that was more inclined or driven to become a Canadian, a homogeneous notion of a Western Canadian. Past 1988, immigrants were encouraged to celebrate the identities, their culture, their diversity from wherever they came. I lived under the previous version for 18 years, and I've seen and lived under our Multiculturalism Act. There's two different ways of perceiving, I think, what it means to be Canadian. I think that sometimes can be a benefit.
Well, two little details in all that. Pierre Trudeau in the 60s was influenced by the integration movements in the US, thinking that maybe the goals of Black activists should be the goals of Indigenous Canadians, and that's where we got integration or citizenship plus. And it isn't exactly what that community wanted, but he may have had goodwill behind that and the example of what was going on in America. The other thing is, I've run into American professors who say the assimilation of new Canadians is at no different rate than it is in America. So America has the melting pot theory, we have multiculturalism, but in effect, people blend into the society when they immigrate here at about the same rate.
I think there is a slight difference, and I think the difference is this, Alan, that Canada has approximately one fifth of our population is foreign immigrant, 20%, 20.6 or 7%, which is the highest in amongst the G8 countries. Germany's foreign population rate is about 13.9%. The US only 12.9%. So we have a far more diverse society than the United States. Now, that causes issues that I think that Pierre Trudeau understood. If we don't recognize the issues and interests of special groups and we marginalize and ignore them, sometimes their interests can only then eventually, through frustration, be expressed through violent actions and protests, which is what often happens with First Nations issues, whether it's Oka, Ipperwash, Caledonia, or maybe new conflicts that may emerge out of the Kinder Morgan pipeline process. And I think it's really important to understand this diversity, that I think when it comes to First Nations people we may be missing out on, and to recognize their issues and to make sure that everybody else understands it so that their concerns are legitimized and addressed effectively.
And you've also researched the diversity within the Indigenous community, which is something that we probably don't think about enough.
I think it's a very important issue. You know, when we think about our diversity, we have people that come from over 172 countries across the world. We have hundreds of languages that are spoken in major metropolitan areas like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, different religions. People come, we encourage them under the Multicultural Act to exercise their identities, to share them, and to create bridging bonds amongst each other. But 90% or more of those people will live in one of the 33 CMAs, major metropolitan areas. 50% of them between Toronto, Montreal, Toronto and Vancouver alone, and most of them between Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and Calgary. Well, our First Nations people don't live in the CMAs. Our First Nations people, who are equally diverse, there's approximately 366 bands living on over 2,000 reservations. They have 11 families of languages, 53 different spoken languages from coast to coast. They're very diverse. We tend to redact them into this homogeneous image of what First Nations people are, but our First Nations people are very diverse. But they don't live in Toronto, they don't live in Montreal, Vancouver, they live on the reservations outside. So their ability to interact and to share the diversity is challenged, and it's obstructed, unlike as it is for other people. So I think we need to make a special effort.
Famous book in Canadian literature, Two Solitudes, talking about the separation of the English and the French, even within a community where they live side by side, Montreal and so on. I think you're painting another couple of solitudes between the urban immigrants and the Indigenous population that live outside the urban areas.
Absolutely.
Speak to the difficulties that presents.
Well, I think the difficulty is that when we have inner city issues, we address those issues fairly promptly for a number of reasons. Political expediency, risk management, whatever they are, we tend to respond to them very quickly. We, year after year, have young people in northern reservations that are committing suicide, that are sniffing gas, they're homeless, there's domestic abuse rates, there's unemployment rates. We are moving entire communities because of forest fires year after year, because of contaminated water year after year. This goes on endlessly. They are suffering from far more attenuated facts of climate change. Their environments are changing far more quickly than they are for us. But we don't address them as they would if they were inner issues. And I think people don't appreciate what some of our rural communities go through, primarily First Nations people.
Now that's all of us in urban areas, but you say there's a special case of so-called new Canadians or immigrants and their understanding of Indigenous history.
Well, when I look at the Missing and Murdered Women's Inquiry, or I look at the apologies that resulted following the residential school report, when I look at the use of the term cultural genocide or genocide and how controversial those issues become, when I look at the fact that people look at the Gladue case law, which requires judges when sentencing First Nations people to look at aggravating factors that may have caused them to engage in those behaviors and then to mitigate it by having other means of sentencing, I think people look at these as an easy way out for First Nations people. That speaks to the fact that these processes are not extended the same amount of legitimacy as others processes that we would deal with on a daily basis. Legitimacy arises from the public understanding the value of the processes that we introduce. And I think when First Nations people, when new immigrants come to Canada, more than 20% of our population is immigrant, as I've said, they're dealing with issues of the communities that they've left behind, the religious conflicts, the political conflicts, the economic issues, the people that they've left behind. They're focused on trying to resolve those issues and to then celebrate their own identity and trying to find their own place in this very diverse and mixed up sort of culture that we have in Canada. let alone trying to understand the First Nations people that don't even live in the city. So I think that that's a special challenge that needs to be recognized at some point.
You've articulated a number of problems, and the old solution is always education and more facts and what have you. But all the institutions, such as schools and police forces and others, would say, we have enough on our plate. We can't add more curriculum or more understanding or resources or people or budgets. So how do we address these things? I think you've got a point that new Canadians need to know about the Indigenous history, and even judges are saying, the courts don't know enough about Indigenous laws and customs and melding those with the Canadian laws and customs. So what do we do?
I think it's a problem that transcends education. I think it's an attitude problem. It's a problem that needs to be addressed by the media, popular media. It needs to be dealt by politicians. It needs to be dealt, I think, by all of us, not just education. But education is a big part of it. We, for example, now have instituted this process of recognizing the traditional lands upon which we hold our meetings, whether they're public or private, by making these statements on traditional lands. This takes place everywhere. But do people really understand the meaning of it? Or are they just token? I mean, we need to understand the importance and significance of this. First Nations people, after all, have a special place in our Constitution unlike anybody else. Under Section 35, they have a right to self-governance. They have the right to have their land claims issues addressed and resolved. We didn't give them those rights under the Constitution. The Constitution recognized those existing treaties, which we have in Canada, unlike the Aborigines in Australia or the First Nations in Brazil. So we have a very special relationship with our First Nations people. But I don't think people quite understand the importance of Section 35 and what that means.
Now, you've also written a book questioning something that is at least tangentially related to all this. And that is when a police officer encounters anyone of any background, for any reason, any age, broken taillight even, you say that that police officer should exercise more discretion. And this is counter to the so-called broken windows theory of policing that Mayor Rudy Giuliani in New York promoted, where you fix the broken windows, you find the perpetrator who broke them, you pick up the litter, you charge the litterer, and that helps solve bigger problems. It doesn't intuitively sound correct, and you researched it. Tell us what you found.
Well, I wrote a book called Mending Broken Fences Policing, rather than Broken Windows Policing, because I think when you are speaking about broken windows policing, you're looking at all of the negative things. You're looking at the broken windows, the graffiti, the taillight. You're looking at all of the negative aspects of what happens in a community. And so you start stigmatizing and stereotyping communities, intentionally or unintentionally, within that contextual view. That's your frame of reference. I think we need to move away from that also and look at the positive aspects of societies and cultures and the special challenges that they have, the special privileges that they bring to this experiment called multiculturalism. And that needs us to refocus our attention from broken things to things that have potential.
Now, cops are pretty good at asking questions and interrogating people. How do you like the shoe on the other foot, answering questions rather than asking them?
Well, I always appreciate this opportunity, and I wish that more people in the security services or policing, customs, immigration, get an opportunity to do this, because it's easy to sit and question somebody and make people feel uncomfortable. We study proxemics, we learn how to get information from people. But to develop empathy, you really need to be in somebody else's shoe. And I think that these opportunities are great, and I would encourage people to put themselves out to have this occur to them. Thank you.
All right, as a good interrogator, what did I forget to ask you?
Alan, as usual, I don't think you leave much behind. It's been a pleasure answering your questions. I think you've brought to light a very important issue that I think we miss, the special role of First Nations people, and trying to make an extra attempt to try and understand their needs and positions in Canadian society.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alan.
Any views expressed in this Lodge Talk don't necessarily reflect the views of any citizens of the Passamaquoddy Nation, its employees, friends, or neighbors. The object is stimulating conversation. Please go to the web, social media, email, or the telephone to join in the Lodge Talk.